In the dark years of Nazi Germany, when speaking out against Adolf Hitler's regime was punishable by death, one young woman dared to raise her voice. Sophie Scholl, only 21 years old, became a symbol of conscience and courage. Together with her brother Hans and a small group of university students, she helped from the White Rose, a resistance movement that distributed leaflets calling for Germans to resist tyranny. Her story ends with her arrest, trial and execution in the February of 1943, but her bravery has echoed through history ever since. She was buried inside of a coffin, near to the prison where she was executed on the guillotine, and today she is buried inside of a communal large grave with two other members of the White Rose. But was this always the case, and specifically, why did the Nazis allow for someone who was deemed a dangerous traitor to have this semi-decent burial, especially after she had been executed? Let's look into the grave of Sophie Scholl, and to support, please subscribe. Sophie Magdalena Scholl was born on May 9th, 1921, in the small town of Furchenberg in southern Germany. She grew up in a large family, the daughter of Robert Scholl, a liberal-minded mayor, and Magdalena Scholl, a devout Lutheran. The Scholls raised their children to value freedom, justice, and individual responsibility. As a teenager, Sophie, like many German youths, was a member of the Hitler Youth movement. At first, she enjoyed the activities and camaraderie, but over time, she became disillusioned. She began to see through the propaganda and notice the harsh realities of the Nazi system. Censorship, the persecution of Jews, and the silencing of anyone who dared to disagree. By the time Sophie enrolled at the University of Munich in 1942 to study biology and philosophy, she had already developed strong moral convictions. She joined her brother Hans and his friends in a quiet but determined campaign of resistance. The White Rose was not military, nor did it carry out violent attacks. Instead, its weapon was the written word. Hans and Sophie, along with Christoph Probst, Alexandra Schomorl, and Willy Graf, and their philosophy professor Kurt Huber, produced leaflets that condemned Nazi crimes and urged Germans to resist. The leaflets were typed by hand and copied using makeshift printing presses. They carried bold messages such as, "Every word that comes from Hitler's mouth is a lie. When he says peace, he means war." The White Rose leaflets spoke of human dignity, freedom, and the moral duty to resist injustice. They also reported on atrocities committed by the Nazis, especially against the Jews and the Poles. Sophie was deeply involved. She smuggled suitcases full of pamphlets by train, leaving them in telephone booths, university hallways, and mailboxes. The group knew they risked everything, but they believed silence in the face of evil itself was a crime. By February of 1943, Germany was facing disaster on the Eastern Front after the crushing defeat at Stalingrad. The White Rose saw this as a chance to speak out more loudly. And on February 18th, Sophie and Hans carried a large stack of leaflets to Munich University. They quietly placed the papers in corridors and classrooms while students attended lectures. As the lecture halls emptied, the leaflets caught attention. At the last moment, Sophie threw a stack of pamphlets from a balcony, letting them flutter down into the atrium. It was a dramatic gesture, one that ensured people would see them. Unfortunately, a janitor named Jakob Schmidt saw what happened and reported them to the Gestapo. Sophie and Hans were arrested on the spot. Sophie was taken to Gestapo headquarters for questioning. At first she denied involvement, but when investigators found incriminating evidence at her apartment, she bravely admitted her role. Instead of trying to save herself, she chose honesty. She told her interrogators, "Somebody had to make a start. What we said and wrote is what many people are thinking. They just don't dare say it." Sophie, Hans, and Christoph Probst, who was soon arrested, were quickly put on trial at the People's Court in Munich. The judge was Roland Freisler, notorious for his screaming rants and harsh sentences. The trial lasted only a few hours. Despite knowing the outcome was certain, Sophie remained calm and defiant. She declared, "You know the war is lost. Why don't you have the courage to face it?" The court found all three guilty of treason, and the sentence was death. On February 22nd, 1943, just 4 days after their arrest, Sophie Scholl, Hans Scholl and Christoph Probst were led to Stadelheim prison in Munich. They were to be executed by guillotine, a method still widely used in Nazi Germany. Before her death, Sophie was allowed a final meeting with her parents. Her father told her, "You will go down in history. There is such a thing as justice." Sophie embraced her mother and calmly said, "Remember me to all." And at around 5 p.m, Sophie was then led to the execution chamber. Witnesses said she walked with her head held high, showing no fear. Her last recorded words were, "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give himself up individually to a righteous cause, such as fine, sunny day and I have to go, but what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" Moments later, the blade fell. Sophie Scholl was dead at 21 years of age. Hans and Christoph followed within minutes. Now, in the aftermath of executions in the Third Reich, there were usually a protocol that was carried out. Those who had lost their heads had their families charged for the execution process. But a large number of the corpses were handed to doctors and scientists for anatomical research. This was especially prevalent for women who were executed, as scientists carried out experiments upon their bodies. Now, Sophie Scholl, it was recorded, was buried in the nearby cemetery at Perlacher Forst, which was located very close to Stadelheim prison, her place of execution. This cemetery is home to around 27,000 graves, including those of Nazi soldiers, displaced people from after World War II, and many other forced labourers. It was used to begin with for those who were executed by the Nazis when they came into power, and some people were buried in the cemetery, and others were burnt in secrecy inside of the nearby crematoria of the Osterhof, in a different burial site. But what is bizarre and strange is the fact that despite the Nazis sentencing Sophie Scholl to death, that she was actually buried and interred inside of a cemetery. There would have known that in death her grave could have become a place where resistors go to meet and congregate, so it's very possible and probable that Sophie, along with her brother Hans and other White Rose members like Christoph Probst, were buried together in a large pit which had its position recorded. There would have been no marker to them created during the Nazis' time in power, and no gravestones, as they did not want to celebrate their enemies. The mass grave theory is probably correct due to the fact that Hans Scholl and Christopher Probst were executed shortly after Sophie. The Scholl family were also relatively well-to-do, meaning Sophie's father could have swayed local officials to have his daughter and son buried rather than cremated. There is also the possibility that the Nazis and prison guards allowed her remains to be buried, as she allegedly went to her death with immense bravery and courage, and that they allowed this to happen out of respect. What is also strange is that there are many graves containing the urns of prisoners from Dachau who had their remains cremated and then interred inside of the same cemetery. This helps us understand that the Nazis in death did allow some people who they deemed as undesirable and traitors to be buried, rather than just wiped off the face of the earth. There were others who were executed inside of the Stadelheim prison who were also buried nearby in the Perlacher Forst cemetery. This included resistance fighters. Now let's remember that Munich, where the graves are, was the birthplace of Nazism, showing how strange it is that the government officials did not particularly intervene to ensure that their enemies were not given a decent burial. Now, inside of the cemetery today, the grave of Sophie Scholl, along with Hans Scholl and Christopher Probst, is marked by memorial stones and also crosses. There is a probability that this is a more modern grave and the bodies were moved at some point, especially as the cemetery suffered bomb damage in the final days of the war. But still today, Sophie Scholl is buried here though, and people come to lay white roses on the grave. Though the White Rose members were silenced, their words live on. Copies of their final leaflet were smuggled out of Germany and reached Allied countries. The Allies later reprinted it and dropped millions of copies over German cities as part of their propaganda campaigns. After the war, Sophie Scholl became one of Germany's most admired figures. Schools, streets and squares were named after her. Her courage was taught to generations of students as an example of moral resistance, and in 2003, a nationwide poll of Germans named her and her brother Hans among the greatest Germans of all time. Her story also continues to inspire people beyond Germany. She represents the idea that even in the darkest times, individuals can make a stand. Though she was young, unarmed and facing one of the most brutal regimes in history, Sophie Scholl chose to act according to her conscience. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And once again, thank you so much for watching.